All right, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We are here this morning into the afternoon for a technical meeting on the topic of medium heavy duty electrification. My name is Chairman Martha Gillette. I'm joined virtually today by my colleagues, the Vice Chairman Jack Pekoski and Michael Karen. We have an agenda in front of us today. I do have a couple of housekeeping notes up front, especially because I think we are fortunate enough to have some folks joining us today that may not be frequent participants in Pura docket. So I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of how this meeting is going to run and what we're looking for, hoping to get out of today. We do transcribe our proceedings. So we have a court reporter with us, and we're also projecting to our YouTube page. But because of that, we ask that any questions or comments that are made during the proceeding are made verbally using the raise hand function, which is under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. In other words, we ask that you please refrain from using the chat function because it's difficult to capture that as we're creating the record. So we do have an agenda that has a lot of time, particularly after the lunch break, for facilitated discussion from stakeholders and any public comment. And I think we'll also have time for questions, both from Pura staff and from other stakeholders for our folks who are presenting today. So again, when it is time to ask questions or make comments, please make sure you're locating the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. And please also make sure to identify yourself by name and affiliation so that we can keep our record clear. For today's technical meeting in this matter, we have put forward a notice of technical meeting and a request for written comments. In accordance with that notice of technical meeting, we have a very specific agenda that we're hoping to tackle today and have included a lot of time and space for comments, particularly if there are any fleet owners or operators that are with us today. So please, if you're a fleet owner or operator, thank you so much for joining us. We really want to hear from you, both your questions for our presenters as well as any feedback that you might have when we get to the stakeholder portion of today's proceeding. I do note that we received some presentations in advance of today, and the authority and staff have reviewed those presentations in preparation for today's meeting. I just want to flag that we noted the utilities presentations cover some topics that are not part of today's agenda, specifically those the slides related to cost recovery. Pura definitely understands that we need to address cost recovery. It is not the focus of today's meeting. It was slated for a later discussion. So we do ask that all participants today focus specifically on the topics for which we are seeking feedback today. So specifically, those topics include medium and heavy duty EV fleet rate design. We're looking for feedback on charging infrastructure incentives, flexible interconnection guidelines, fleet advisory services, evaluation, measurement, and verification, and the overall program budgetary cap. So that is a big chunk of information that we're hoping to get comments on today. And we do have a request for written comments that is out and is due in a week or two. So we ask that you focus your comments and feedback on the topics that were noticed in the notice of technical meeting. For now, we will turn over to, I believe we have a joint presentation from Eversource and UI, followed by Pura staff and stakeholder questions. And I believe we have the presentation up. So I see Mr. Bond has come off of mute if you're going to kick us off here. We will turn the virtual floor over to you, sir.
I am. Thank you very much, Chair Gillette. Thanks for having us, and to Vice Chair Pekoski and Commissioner Karen and all other stakeholders who are present. Thanks for having us today. My name is Kevin Bond. I'm the manager of Clean Energy Strategy at Eversource, and I'll introduce the rest of our panel. With me today is Doug Horton, Vice President of Distribution Rates, Ed Davis, Director of Rates, Marissa Peruta, Director of Revenue Requirements, and Sean Tully, our e-mobility manager. I'll turn it over to Scott or Christina to introduce the United Illuminating panel before I take us through the agenda.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Christina Fucicchia with UI. I am a manager of Smart Grids Innovation and Planning, working on many of our transportation electrification programs across our operating companies here at Avangrid. Here with me today, I have Andrea Van Lolling and Jacob Hurwitz, as well as Mark Kolka and myself, Christina Fucicchia. Thanks.
And then will the case coordinator be putting the slides up? Fantastic. Great, thank you very much. I think we can go to the agenda slide, which is next. So the agenda slide has a brief discussion of cost recovery, followed by the rates prompts that were in the Appendix 1 proposal in the latest notice of technical session. Then I'll be taking us through some of our thoughts and challenges around the incentive proposal from the same. Christina will be taking us through some of the other considerations that were part of that proposal. And then at the end, we just have if you'll indulge us, a brief clarification request for the authority. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea Van Lolling of United Illuminating.
This is Andrea. This was the slide I believe we were asked not to speak to. So over to rates.
If I could just, I agree, we're not going to dwell on it, but I do think it's important to know we'll focus today on the structural comments, but we do, and it's a common theme, at least for Eversource in a number of dockets at this point, that it is important that we acknowledge the timeliness of recovery of these important programs, which we do support advancing, and certainly this is one of them, but we do have concerns with the lack of that in the initial straw proposal, and look forward to those future discussions, but feel it's important to emphasize that that is a necessary component, and none of the rest of this can happen if we don't have that in place.
Great, and then Ed Davis will take us through the rates discussion.
Okay, good morning. So I'm going to tag team with Mark Kolka. I think everything here is reflective of both utilities' perspectives, and obviously there's some unique differences, but let me just jump right in. Just to kind of level set, as a result of the investigation and our work and development of rate designs, we submitted, it was the January 10th report, several rate designs, specifically 3 rate designs, kind of targeting 3 use cases, generally speaking, predicated on the following. So we have the current, recently implemented light duty EVSE rates that each EDC has implemented. So we expanded that for purposes of this investigation, and that was referred to as Scenario 1 rate designs. We then also reviewed and developed rate designs after looking at the PG&E business EV rate plan that they've had in place, and we gained a lot of insight, and then looked at our own rate design and built a structure off of that. That was our Scenario 2 proposal. And then the third scenario was for investigating UI's LPT rate design, but enhancing and making modifications along the lines of a tiered demand structure. So those are the 3 designs that we developed and presented. Today's focus is on scenarios 1 and 2 per the prompts from the authority. And we're also going to touch on, also covered there is the time of use, questions on time of use periods. So we'll focus on those items today. Scenario 1, which both EDCs, believe is probably the preferred option, It does kind of extend the rate design goals that were implemented under a working tariff that, like I said, is in place today for light duty. And it applies that to targeted use cases. So there were a number of parameters in there that, features that we modified for purposes of medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. We do believe, as identified in the report, it does strike a balance among a number of key rate making, customer and program development objectives. The rate design is an operational rate, and therefore we believe it can be easily adopted in our current billing systems. It's also based on because of that design, an established rate design process and readily available data that we apply not only in the light duty sector, but also for the proposal here in scenario 1. We also think one of the merits we believe of this being a preferred option among the other items I just mentioned is that having a single option is administratively more efficient and I believe conducive to a positive customer experience. So, those are kind of high level features. Obviously, there is a lot of technical aspects of these designs, which we're glad to address and answer any questions on. Scenario 2 is, I would say, I characterize a little less progressive than the scenario 1 design. It certainly does meet the rate design goals and objectives, but cannot be readily implemented. And I do want to comment that the rate we investigated was a subscription rate. What we ended up proposing, and we explained, the basis of that is not necessarily a subscription rate. So the last bullet I have here kind of highlights some key considerations, particularly the complexity with customer choice and experience, things like chasing subscription rates, buy-through charges, and a number of other things that we kind of learned a little bit from talking with PG&E and their experience. And also just the practical outcome of that is you end up with a kind of demand charge that sort of converges on what we at least represented in our proposed rate design. We don't have an established structure in our billing system. Neither company does. And we recognize while we've got proxy rates in there, there's additional analytical work that will be needed to design this rate. These are really high-level comments, and I'll ask Mark Kolka if you had anything you want to add to these first two before I get to time of day periods.
No, that summed it up very well, Ed. Thank you. And we used in scenario 2, UI used in scenario 2, the tariff GST distribution demand rate, because we have not conducted any type of marginal cost or marginal analysis, and we haven't done that in a while, so it would take time to ramp up to do exactly that. Thus, right now, the only thing we can offer is that with the tariff rate for distribution demand charge.
Okay, actually, if I could come and add to that from Eversource's perspective, I mentioned that we use proxy rates. We did conduct a marginal cost analysis, but what we have is just that. It's not a full study necessarily, but it is representative, at least based on the assumptions we made of a marginal cost rate for distribution. And the reason we needed to do that is that's a standout feature in the PG&E rate that they used their form, based on their costs and whatever analysis they actually did perform, a marginal cost-based rate. So we placed something in there, but I think that's one of those aspects of the rate design in terms of the pricing itself that would still need to be updated. And so it's part of the analytical work I alluded to. But structurally, we've maintained both scenario 1 and 2, of course, include time of use rate for many of the components of service. And that was an essential feature that I think for all 3 scenarios was one of the requirements. Okay, so I'm sure we may have questions and we can certainly address some more details. Just to finish the slide, the time of day periods, certainly something that is of interest, and I think that's quite a topic, quite a largely covered topic, wherever time of use or time of day or time varying rates are being raised, particularly with these new initiatives and new initial rates. We designed rates based on our current time of day periods. They are cost reflective and transparent in that sense. Considerations of changes to the time of day periods, whether it's the number of hours and number of periods or when they start and end and those kinds of things. They really, especially at this sort of nascent point in development in the market, we don't really have a robust set of customers and usage patterns. And while we are looking at specific use cases here, we do believe only after evaluation of cost of service characteristics for each component of service, and I mean that for distribution, transmission, supply, and a significant level of participation where we can obtain, a robust set of customer usage demand patterns and requirements. I think that will much better inform, at least on the customer side, what their needs are, but on the company side, for the various services, what the characteristics are for providing service. And I know there are also further considerations such as locational or at least levels of service within a company that I think of, for example, were reflected in the prompt for scenario 3. Just to illustrate that, I think those will all bear out as we, first of all, have more information, a better market, but also technology enablers where we can have the appropriate level of data. For example, AMI data. I mean, there's, the granularity of that data is very important for these kinds of analyses. And so there's a number of considerations there, but, as a starting point, we do have reasonable time of day periods that, like I said, are cost reflective and transparent. And we factored as best we could into all 3 scenario analyses and development. Scenario 2 is not necessarily a kind of revenue neutral rate design. So, it doesn't quite have a class revenue requirement to design to, whereas scenario 1 does because it is predicated on an otherwise applicable rate. So those kinds of things just sort of open up the question of, what are the characteristics of costs to provide service? And it is very important in looking at time of day periods. So it's kind of a point we want to make. We were asked to address that. And I think it's part of an ongoing dialogue. And certainly when we have technology enablers that can allow for more advanced rate design, I think that'll be another important consideration. So with that, I don't know if Mark, if you're good with that, we can, Chairman, I don't know if we're entertaining questions now or later, whatever you prefer.
I'll just add one more thing into the time of use issue is that these advanced rate designs are being looked at in the context of the final AMI plan, which is due to be filed by November 20th of this year. So it's UI's expectation that we will be able to talk to any type of time of use rate and time of use rate design, including time periods in the context of the AMI, the final AMI plan.
So
other than that, I have no additional comments.
Okay.
Thank you both. And Mr. Davis, to your question, I think I'd like to get through the whole presentation and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Very good. Okay.
Okay, we can go to the next slide then, please. All right, so we included this just to make sure that we accurately understood what was put forth by the authority in their attachment 1 incentive proposal. So this reflects the EDC's understanding of that proposal, just to make sure that all parties are on the same page. So going through this, the proposal is to implement our recommendation of the $1,300 per kilowatt for make-ready infrastructure. It's to cap incentives for any given customer. So it's on a per customer basis at a calculated estimated 10 years incremental revenue as done by a fleet advisory services vendor. And it based on that customer's chosen fleet EV rate. That it would be 100% of that calculation for public fleets and 50% of that calculation for private fleets. That any difference between the $1,300 per kilowatt and the 10-year revenue cap could be applied to EVSE. And that it would require customers to apply to any outside federal or state funding grants where they're available and aligned, and that it would allow stacking, but not to exceed the total project cost. So that's our understanding of what the proposal is, and we further kind of lay out 2 examples how we think it's intended to work. So example 1 would be a bus fleet wants to install 10 100 kilowatt nameplate capacity chargers for a total of 1 megawatt. An example is that their 10-year distribution revenue estimate is $1.5 million. The make ready is 1.3 million. So you could apply the full make ready, and there would be $200,000 left to apply to EVSE. That's how we think it's intended to work. And then in example 2, same thing, except a lower 10-year revenue estimate. So that would, the total make ready would be capped at that revenue estimate, and there would be nothing left over for an EVSE incentive. So that's our understanding of what was proposed. I think we can go to the next slide. So we just thought one more time to emphasize what we consider make ready, only because I think in the original procedural order, there was a footnote that defined it as utility side upgrades. And we just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page of what make ready means. So to us, it's everything within this green box, the utility side, and then the customer side, but both of those things considered make ready. We get consistent customer feedback that points to the need for incentives for both customer side and utility side make ready for projects to be viable. And then we would just note that, within our other programs in our other jurisdictions, and even our light duty program, that's the common definition of make ready, and it's the definition for utility programs across the country. So we just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page for that as well. And then we can go to the final slide on incentive structure. And we just wanted to highlight some of the potential challenges that the proposal in attachment 1 raises. So primarily, it's tying the incentive cap for any given customer to a calculated 10-year incremental revenue presents them, I think, significant challenges in terms of being able to calculate that accurately. So what the feedback that we've gotten from customers is that clearly not every customer is going to install their full fleet from day one. So we'll have a staging of electrification. Accurately predicting that staging could be problematic in terms of being able to calculate the incremental revenue. And then just all the assumptions that go around what routes, charging patterns, vehicle efficiency will be over a 10-year period would introduce some difficulties or unknowns in calculating that revenue accurately. Another concern is so the incentive to maybe overestimate what the incremental distribution revenue would be for any given customer in order for them to sort of maximize their upfront incentive for make ready and EVSE. And so there's an incentive to overstate the estimated usage. There might be an incentive to misrepresent their or incorrectly represent their ability to charge off peak. It might influence the rate they choose to calculate this revenue under. And then it leaves a problem of, well, given all that, if the revenue doesn't end up being close to what they what the vendor and the customer with the customer's input estimated the incremental revenue to be, it leaves us with a deficit. So it's difficult to conceive of mechanisms to overcome that, which is why we would just point back to the maybe not perfect, but the more understood cap that we proposed in our January 10th filing regarding just setting a cap at 3 megawatts, which is based on some other utility program experiences. Second point would just be, we don't really have the basis to really determine if basing a cap on estimated incremental distribution revenue is sufficient or not sufficient, just based on our lack of experience with the wide range of customer use cases in the fleet segment. Even if you take a discrete segment like school buses, what we've heard from partner utilities who have done a number of school bus implementations is that every site is different. So you might have a town who's got a school bus fleet of 50 who charges and drives and has a use pattern of one way, and a town right next door who does it completely different. It's really not a cookie cutter approach even within a given range. I mean, it varies widely even by segment. And then sort of the third challenge is, the proposal doesn't appear from what was in attachment 1 to point to a discrete program budget. So it is open-ended from a total spending perspective. So it's difficult to plan for. There's no annual budget where there's a level of uncertainty about the number of customers who would enter the program and the level of customer adoption within that. And then, the unknown that I brought up before about the level of associated revenues with the program. So that just makes it difficult to staff for, plan for, raise capital for, et cetera. So from there, I think we can pass it to Christina to talk about some of the other program considerations.
They blocked it, and I was just like,
In terms of other program considerations that were addressed in the response, we want to make sure that we exemplify the fact that we do support the stacking of incentives. There's many outside funding sources, the EPA school bus funding, for example, in New York State. In one of our other jurisdictions, we do have a voucher incentive program similar to California's for the vehicles themselves. And there are other associated costs that are allowable under those incentives. And we want to make sure that those incentives are leveraged by our customers, also minimizing the impact to ratepayers for the total project cost. We also do want to understand that we're not going to provide incentives that are going to exceed the total project cost to that customer as well. We do want to note, though, that the timing of these types of grants and the incentives that are available may provide some barriers in terms of how we do understand the stacking of the incentives and to ensure that the total project cost isn't exceeded. So we'll have to think about, how to align the different types of incentives along with our make-ready incentives for the customers to make it easy for them so that it doesn't create a barrier to completing their projects, but also allow them to appropriately leverage the outside funding that's there. The second thing is just re-emphasizing the expanded scope of the EM&V vendor. Just want to make sure that we're noting that it would come with expanded costs, and it's not there. The expanded budget, sorry, the expanded scope is not currently part of the light duty cost budget there as well. In terms, next slide, in terms of the a need of the fleet advisory services, we have found in some of our other jurisdictions that fleet advisory services is definitely a gap, and there's a need for that from our fleet customers. They're trying to figure this out as they start to crawl before they walk and run. Fleet advisory services can be a really good value add to help them through their process and figuring out how to electrify. That being said, not every fleet advisory service engagement turns into a Make Ready program in our other jurisdictions, and we see that happening here as well. The other understanding is that some of these fleet advisory services are somewhat costly, as noted in some of the comments as well. And so, what is the, potential cost share if they don't move forward through the Make Ready incentive program for providing those services to fleets that aren't ready to move forward after they sort of understand where their project could be. Again, I think we're just trying to get a better understanding of if this is an added service that we're providing to our customers and standing up as part of the program. How do we recover some of those costs that are not necessarily going to generate revenue per se for increased utilization if the customers aren't moving forward at that specific time. In terms of the flexible interconnection piece of the proposals, we do agree that working with our medium and heavy duty fleets in Connecticut to integrate DERMS and other types of load management solutions, whether it be through a load management technology incentive pilot, an electric school bus vehicle grid integration pilot program, or other types of solutions. It's really important to make sure that there's right sizing happening, that as Kevin was mentioning earlier, that the fleet understands that there's ways to charge off peak that would ultimately potentially decrease the need for a larger capacity at that site. And a lot of planning does come into that. We expect that the fleet advisory service would allow for that program to be developed. We also see that there are a number of opportunities already happening through the IES programs that are looking at load management solutions. But the reality is that really these are still in pilot stage. We're not necessarily at a place at the EDC side to rely on some of those solutions as part of the total capacity build out until we're able to have a better understanding of what that really means to the distribution system. I think, and that is all we had on the other program considerations.
Great. And so just move.
Sorry, there was one last slide there.
To the final slide. And this is just for, feel free to give us any answer that you're able to, but just for our own planning purposes, we're hoping to gain some insight as to what the ultimate goal of the July final decision would be, and whether that's like to move to an adjudicated proceeding in order to implement a program or in order to develop a program. We're just, we're not entirely certain about what we're driving towards, and we're just hoping if you're able to give us some insights to that, we would greatly appreciate it. And that's all. And I believe that concludes the presentation. So thank you very much for listening. We're open to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Bond, and thank you to each of our presenters. We do have a lot of questions. I'm not sure that I can address your request for clarification other than to point you to the notes of proceeding. I will say that if there are updates to the schedule, in terms, whenever we're in a docket, our best intentions to drive towards a draft decision and a final decision depend in part on the discovery process and whether we have adequate information in the record to move forward. So to the extent that we get responses to the written comments in today's presentation, and we still have outstanding areas of questions about program development, then the July decision date could slip. And if there are changes to that schedule, we would notice it publicly in the Lotus docket. So I know that's not exactly your question, but the notice of proceeding does does talk about strategies to optimize integration of the vehicles, transit buses into the grid, looking at potential rate design and infrastructure solutions. So I think we're very intentionally marching towards a program design to the extent that we can get there in the record. So it's probably the extent of what I can say right now. So I do know that we have a number of questions from authority staff and definitely want to have time for stakeholders as well. But maybe I can start with, I apologize, I don't remember who on my staff was going to start. Ms. Bygrass, maybe?
Yes, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to the companies for presenting this morning. Laura, is it possible to actually bring the presentation back up? Thank you. And can we move to slide 4? Perfect, thank you. So going back to the rate design, thank you very much for providing that overview. So could the companies explain a little bit further about why the scenario 1 rate design is the preferred rate design for medium and heavy duty EV charging? Is it preferred mostly because it's already in place in the light duty EV program, the kind of tariffs that this is based on? Yes, could you provide just a little bit more detail on that?
Sure. Glad to. So let me start. There's always a practical consideration. So yes, the rate is, we have basically the identical rate with some modifications in place today. So given that whatever technology considerations we have a current billing system, current metering, data management, those kinds of things, but also an existing plan. That's one consideration. It's something that we believe with the modifications that we filed here could be readily implemented. The origin of that rate design went back to quite a long investigation, ultimately for light duty, where at that time, I think what surfaced and was the most important element of that design was the Rocky Mountain Institute model, which when that model came out, there were a number of really early on rate designs that were out, various utilities trying to address, how do we start up the market and what kind of rates are appropriate. We had things like demand charge holiday and schedules of different rate structures that changed over time. The Rocky Mountain Institute model, sort of as I understood it, and we spent a lot of time evaluating and trying to understand how it's applied, really kind of took the best features and tried to resolve some of the issues that were surfacing when other utilities were trying to implement those. California, Portland, General Electric, a number of utilities. So I believe that's the guidance from the authority that came from that, sort of the wisdom of that is, hey, here's a design that's much more dynamic and it addressed, some of the learnings and insights. And what we have is a sliding scale load factor rate. What are the key issues that we address? I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but trying to get some kind of a time of use rate, which among other things addresses, the distribution system and the fact we're bringing on new load. The demand charge barrier, because demand charges at a low load factor, are really, very costly when you're not, using charging that much. Now that was all for light duty and much smaller scale. So what we have here is all of those features, like I said, a dynamic rate structure built off of, we have to assume some revenue requirement because it's a new market and we don't exactly know what the cost of service will be sort of at a class level, but we have existing rates that would apply if a customer just needed a rate to be served under today, we would say, what's an applicable, general service rate today? But starting with that and expanding with this light duty rate structure, sliding scale, load factor, time of use rates, the lower the load factor, the more of your charge is volumetric and time differentiated. Those kinds of features are really important, but they're also quite flexible as a particular customer's load grows. Now translate that to medium and heavy duty. First of all, the scale and the impact of these are much larger. A home vehicle charge or a public charging is one thing, but when you're looking at a fleet of Condot buses, and the evolution and the plan they have to move toward a full EV fleet, if you will, there's a lot of considerations. So whatever you do is going to have much larger or significant impacts from a rate design perspective. There's other features like managed charging. In fact, if I recall, I think I responded to one of the data requests, and I forget the name of the technology, but there's a charge management technology that I believe fleet management system of some kind. I forget the name of it. I apologize, but it's something I read in their report, and something that they want to be able to take advantage and have a rate design that kind of matches up with their plans for technologies to manage their fleet. So you have all those considerations, but really you're looking at a much larger scale. So we expanded this. We designed it to a higher load factor, but an operating assumption with fleets and particularly, any of these use cases, I believe is an expectation of a higher load factor to begin with, on sort of in general, but also quite a range. There's an evolution. This is going to be transitional. And so for any given charging station where that rate applies, you're going to see some growth and variation through time. So again, having a dynamic flexible rate like this better matches up with lots of variables. And it's still early. The light duty rate's brand new, but it just seems to be the most balanced approach to rate design. And again, the practical considerations are we can do it. We still have an existing billing system that is expected to morph into something different in the future where we can do something even more sophisticated and complex. And of course, the more complex you make it, the more moving parts. So there's a lot of considerations. But I think it's a solid starting point that can be implemented readily. And obviously we can talk about the details and the features of it and further, review that and see what we want to change. But I think it's a really solid starting point. So that's Mr. Golka can add to that, but we've collaborated a lot on this, and I think we're very much of the same kind of mind and alignment on that. For a lot of the reasons I mentioned, and maybe I missed some, so I don't know if Mark wants to add, but I do feel you kind of get excited about, hey, this is actually a design that seems workable and might be found to be quite satisfactory, particularly on a customer side. So anyway, I could talk for a while on this, but those are sort of the high level points.
I have nothing to add to the summary.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
That was very helpful. So specifically on the RMI study that you mentioned, was that, do you know if they just included light duty electric vehicles in their analysis, or did they also include medium and heavy duty vehicles?
I don't recall if it was those specific classes of vehicles, but I do recall it was targeted at more commercial charging. And I think that does cover a broad range. You know, I mean, school buses, and anything's larger than, you know, on the lower end of sort of size and magnitude and charging requirements in the medium heavy duty kind of range, might be very similar to, you know, larger light duty fleets. But if I recall, they were not small, and I think they were for DC fast chargers, and maybe that's sort of an indicator. It's almost as if you could replace the class, whether it's medium, heavy duty, or light duty, with, is it network charging? Is it DC fast charging? And then it gets into the magnitude and scale. Obviously, you know, the larger stations with multiple large volume or large demand level charging is going to have a much bigger impact on infrastructure needs and capacity and delivery needs. But I think it still boils down to the same core sort of type of charging. Again, DC fast charging, so higher voltage, much larger demand levels, and then you know, whether you have one or more vehicles connected to a station that's served by this rate. Very common characteristics. So the RMI also, I'm trying to recall, there was an awful lot of you know, great insight from the, like I said, these larger commercial type applications. I don't think it got into like super large, you know, very, very large stations, but, you know, if nothing else, and remember, right, we're still at an early stage, and, you know, there's a lot of learning to occur, but I think it serves as a good platform, even with the scope of what that design was built off of by RMI.
Great, thank you. And so my understanding of the EVSE tariffs that exist right now, that the scenario one is based on, are designed for direct current fast chargers that are building up how often they're being used. And so the scale up is basically assisting the business case for commercial chargers that are going to be used essentially as destination chargers or things like that. And so I'm wondering that, given that that is a very specific charging behavior or pattern, is that similar to how fleets charging behavior will be? And therefore, is scenario one applicable to fleet charging, in that the goal is to essentially have charging occur, you know, 24 hours or as often as possible?
Yeah, I mean, part of the challenges we had were, you know, the data you're asking about. We did ask for that, or we kind of identified we had only so much data to work with. The interesting features of the rate design is it's intended to work across a range, but we don't really have a specific usage pattern that we designed it off of. You know, it's really important to recognize that we could have not only, you know, it's going to be a growing class, if you will, if you want to group all the different chargers together, but the characteristics are going to vary quite a bit depending on, and it can vary by day, by month. You know, it's you know, it's enough to try to design a rate that has some sort of a revenue requirement that's on a homogeneous, you know, uniform pattern where you know, you have these common characteristics. This design needs to work under many, many different circumstances. And it's also supposed to work in a way that, as I see it, customers will be exposed to things like, we call it, you know, so-called price signals, but, you know, based on the rate, to the extent, you know, they can vary their operations to make more efficient use of that rate. You know, it gives a price and a rate structure that they can depend on, and then design their charging and manage it, you know, to that. So it's a little bit of chicken and egg. But you know, it's a little bit more flexible than sort of a standard rate where you just have a static, you know, fixed set of prices. We have and if you look at scenario one, there's a schedule attached to it, we broadened the schedule to a much wider set of bands, but it covers that whole range of load factor, which is more of a derivative measure, but it's really levels of demand, covers that broad range for a class of service, large general service rates, generic. It isn't overly dependent on specific, types of batteries or charging or vehicles. It covers the service requirements needed for that kind of load. And it provides sort of a balance between that fixed cost recovery and the variable, signals so that customers can benefit from managing your load to a time of use characteristic, as well as making the most efficient use of the demand level they need. So, you have these features that are cost-based rates, but they're not for any one given application. They're trying to cover the broad range of all these medium and heavy duty applications. So a much higher load factor for the design, and much wider bands, like 7% versus I think 3 to 5% in the light duty. So we recognize a much broader spectrum and a whole different kind of characteristic in general of medium and heavy duty fleets.
Oh, I apologize. Mr. Bonner, were you going to add something?
I was just going to add that what Ed just described is the mirror of what I talked about in the difficulty in estimating 10-year incremental revenue. Is that every fleet behaves differently, or potentially behaves differently. And so it's a challenge in designing a rate that would assist every fleet, because it's hard to categorize them as a class of any kind before we have information. We just don't have the information readily available to be able to. It's not like a building or a certain class of buildings where it's very predictable what their usage is going to be, and so we design rates to that. We're dealing in such a nascent market with such nascent technology that those patterns of behavior aren't necessarily available to us.
Right, I understand that. Thank you. So given that fleet charging behavior will likely be very different, and there are many different fleets with different needs, do you think that it would benefit the fleets to have multiple options or multiple rate design options to choose from that could better fit what their expectations are or what their needs are?
My opinion is having, if you have again, I'll just use scenario one as the example, but a rate that does cover the range of individual and collective use cases, if you will, how they may want to operate, but also provides them rates that act as tools that they can rely on to make decisions and schedule charging and operate, again, with that in mind. Having multiple rate options to me is adding confusion. It may or may not work, and I'm not, anti multiple rate options, but I don't think that's the way to go. I think I also believe what we do now could lead to a next generation of rates. So I think having a solid starting point, again, if scenario one is considered a workable rate design and covers many of the range of uses and use cases, I think having one rate of that kind that is responsive and dynamic can bring us a long way here. I think adding any other rate option, they can always take a general service rate, that we have in place that's available. And I just think the features of that don't meet the other objectives that we design these rates to. So I think we need something to start with and work with that for a while. Having multiples, it's just going to make it more complex, and it's that difficult decision question. I mean, if if your focus is on managing your fleet, and then you have to think about multiple rates, and maybe I think that's more complex and very difficult. And the analogy might be when we looked at subscription rates, it was a constant, never-ending battle for customers to set a subscription level, and then when they got the result and managed their fleet, they kept coming back and changing the subscription rate, constantly chasing that. And the analogy there is, so imagine you have 2 or 3 or more rates that customers have to choose, from. I just think that alone is really difficult and complex. And I think this is going to get more complex as we go. But I think keeping it a little more simple and stable with one rate and one set of a rate structure with set of prices that work and that can be used to manage a fleet is enough. and I think scenario one does check a lot of the boxes as a great starting point and something we work with for some time. My opinion, informed, quite a bit, but that's how I see it.
Great, thank you. And I would just ask, does UI have a similar opinion or think differently?
Think similarly. We have many different types of customers, and customers of the same type have varying load shapes, varying sizes. So the medium and heavy duty fleet vehicles are really no different than other customers in that there's a wide range of operational characteristics that all these different types of customers can have. And we generally have rates that are based on the costs to provide service over a wide range of possibilities. So I caution against the proliferation of tariffs because we could end up having multiple tariffs as we get more beneficial electrification coming in. We could have multiple tariffs for any type of end use, and it becomes quickly unmanageable. Unmanageable for the companies, unmanageable for customers who have to wade their way through a number of different options. Whereas if they have one option that's robust, they can adapt their behavior to minimize the imposition of their costs on the system, because ultimately all these different loads impose costs on the system, and that's what the companies need to send a price signal to. So if we are trying to send a price signal based on this is what's happening to the system when you use it, and if you use it during cheaper times, you can have a lower rate, then that's a well-established principle. But if we're designing not to overcome a grid challenge or not to overcome the demand barrier, but to overcome a competitive fuel, like to overcome the cost of diesel, to make this cheaper than diesel, then having a complicated rate design is not necessarily, I think, the way to do that. If the public policy is to reduce the cost so that they can operate their fleets less expensively with electricity, there's other ways to do that than complicated rate designs. So I think we just need to be careful, because we can end up with literally hundreds of rate designs in the future as we go along with the beneficial electrification that is the state energy policy.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So for scenario 2, could the companies provide a little bit more detail about what the implementation would look like for that? So what the estimated timeline or costs for development would be?
So we're going to provide responses to some questions to be submitted tomorrow. it's actually been a big open question because it's not an existing rate structure. So the question would be, how can we, I mean, even with scenario one, we have to still, if you effectively kind of clone an existing rate. So there is some work to do that and time and expense, but I'm not sure if we can do something similar, that it would be that much different. It's a simpler rate structure. It doesn't have some of the detailed, capabilities of scenario one. So it's a pretty straightforward rate structure, especially if we're predicating it on largely based on an existing structure. But I'll have more on that when we respond tomorrow in our data responses.
So for UI, the way we vision scenario two, it's very similar to the first generation of EV tariff that we had, where we eliminated the demand charge and we put everything on a kWh or energy basis. The difference here being that distribution demand charge. And that's really the key to the complexity of this, because as we have it right now, as we proposed it, using the rate GST tariff demand, that could be fairly simple and straightforward to do. We still have to create it in our SAP billing system, but there'd be no new types of design that would have to be done there. But it's the determination of that distribution demand charge. If it's not going to be based on an average or embedded cost of service, if it's going to be based on a marginal cost of or marginal analysis of some sort, UI is not at this time capable of doing that. We have to build a capability to do that. And that will take time because we have not done a marginal cost of service study. Unless we were to take the results directly from the avoided cost service studies that are used for the valuation of the conservation programs, then we can get a number from there. But that number comes up to be, at least from what I've seen, much higher than the existing rate GST distribution demand charge. So if we want to have a distribution demand charge that is lower than the tariff, then we need to come up with a method to do that. And the company does not know at this time what the preferred method would be, how we would maybe map that long run avoided cost that I believe is very close to the long run marginal cost, if not exact, and modify it so that it has somewhat of a short run component too, and that would drop it down. But that's a lot of analysis, and we could really benefit from having a particular methodology specified. Now, whether we specify it and propose it or how that happens, I don't know. But right now, we're not capable of doing a marginal analysis today.
Mark, I want to add something. So a couple of really important points. We can come up with a rate, right? And the important part is, I believe you need to strike a balance so that it's sufficient. I'm talking about the distribution rate because there's only one demand charge in this proposal. The other demand charges have all been converted to volumetric rates. And I don't know if those are sufficient either, but we don't have any other distribution charge, but for a customer charge, and we have a proxy demand charge. So we can come up with a number, and Mr. Cole could just kind of walk through a number of thoughts about that. But it's not clear. With that, I want to make it clear that we started looking at a subscription rate, and this is not that. This is a monthly demand charge in lieu of that. If we were to implement a subscription rate, you're talking about more FTEs and more administration And that's probably both on the customer and the company side. So that I just want to point out that's not reflected in what we came up with and submitted. But that's important to recognize. If I assume in the question you were working off of our proposal. So with that, I think we'd still have to come back and revisit the pricing. And that would be true for all the components. But we really, our mantra was to try to be as close to what we learned and what we applied for the PG&E rate itself. So that's our starting point. I don't know if that helps in your original question, but there's a lot of other things that need to be done analytically and to ensure we have rate and cost recovery sufficiency in the pricing that will go into that structure. So I just want to point those out.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
So thank you for discussing rate design. I think I'm going to move quickly to the incentive structure. So Laura, if we can move to slide 7. So thank you for pointing out the potential challenges that are associated with the incentive structure. So with the incentive to gaming, do the companies have any recommendations or suggestions for how to address this challenge with the incentive structure?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll start, and Christina, feel free to add anything, but I think, when I initially discussed this slide, that's what I pointed back to our proposal, which would be to not use this incremental revenue calculation to determine the incentive cap because of all of these issues. So I don't have a recommendation to use this structure and overcome the challenges that it presents.
Yeah, and I just would note that, we do note it as an incentive to gaming, but this also, all of these scenarios can happen with a fleet that is wholeheartedly looking at trying to estimate what their usage patterns might be with us, and not necessarily, in a malicious way even, right? So I think that, these are issues that we're grappling with in the industry itself. From a fleet perspective is, what solution and technology are we moving towards when it comes to decarbonization? Electrification is certainly one of the larger favored options right now, but there are some others out there. How much of their fleet do they need to be estimating in terms of transitioning that over? Is there going to be any quote unquote right sizing of that fleet? So is it doing an estimate of a 1-for-1 scenario? Like currently I have 100 vehicles that are operating at this many miles and use this much fuel. If I had to translate that into all electric, this is what it could potentially look like. But we don't necessarily know if those behavior patterns or the type of way that we'll use that fleet will change over time. So there's a lot of difficulty in trying to calculate what that incremental revenue is, and for us to have the assurance from the EDC side to be able to rely on these estimates for guaranteed revenue makes it pretty difficult in terms of thinking of how to create that cap. So again, similar to Kevin, we don't really necessarily have a different option, just that this makes it very difficult for us to, and our customers to come up with some of these calculations.
Great, I appreciate that. Thank you. So that is the end of my questioning, Chairman. Defer to you if you would like to move to other staff for lunch.
Thanks, Ms. Firegrass. We're going to take Ms. Cohen's questions and see if we can wrap up our questions for the EDCs before we take our lunch break.
Okay, great. I'll try to be quick here. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the presentation and the discussion thus far. Want to pick up on that thread about, I think we can stick with the same slide. in kind of the, maybe gaming is not the right word to talk about it, but basically like if there's a misalignment in terms of the initial estimates with, incremental sales not coming to fruition. I think that's the point that's being raised by the utilities here. And so just wanted to see if folks on the meeting can comment on, like essentially like a clawback provision or something similar of that nature, that concept at least, and whether that's being used, in other programs here in Connecticut, and if that could be applied here, if you've given that any thought in coming to this proposal. And I know that we have written comments coming forward as well, so maybe there's more details coming.
So I want to answer your question, but I also want to kind of double back on the second point here in terms of whether or not the increment of distribution revenue cap could either be sufficient or insufficient for the customer. And so I think this begs the question sort of are we trying to incentivize these fleets to move towards electrification? And, what type of incentive and how much incentive do we need to be able to do that? So I think that, you're asking, I just want to clarify what you're asking. So you're asking us to provide an incentive to customers that we can, and help them to estimate what their potential utilization might be so that we can pay the system back. But then if they are unable to appropriately come up with the right calculation, we're going to have them, find some sort of scenario of giving that incentive back to us. Is that the question you're asking?
It's one way to think about it. I think I appreciate your point in that the broader goal obviously is to support electrification. I think from our perspective, and maybe I'll just put this out here and then see what you all have, how you might respond or how it might change. But essentially, if we're looking at it also from the cost containment and customer perspective, customer protection perspective, and so if not for that type of check, let's call it, if maybe not a clawback, like alignment and expectations a few years out or something like that, is there other approaches that the utilities have thought about in kind of moving to this broader fleet electrification standpoint to ensure that any upfront incentives aren't being unduly burdened or resulting in over incentives to kind of balance out in the ratepayer costs?
I would say we haven't put a lot of thought into something like that. I think there are numerous ways that we could come up with to claw back or find solutions to help deter customers from potentially overestimating if they don't need to. One thing that I will kind of note just in general from the market perspective is some of the experience that we have in New York. We do have an open docket there, and the second part of that proceeding is not just for the medium and heavy duty incentive, but also kind of considering the proactive and anticipatory planning that has to happen in terms of creating a larger capacity distribution system to support this increased electrification load, specifically from medium and heavy duty vehicles, but also just in general, larger and broader beneficial electrification. So I think that, again, not to not answer the question, but at the same time, we certainly can come up with some scenarios that could help to help deter customers from potentially overestimating or, not creating a scenario that they can't, generate the revenue because of the utilization. But that being said, we're trying to understand whether or not that's going to help really incentivize customers to want to do this. And if that's going to end up being a larger barrier to moving forward towards electrification, if we do put some of those types of mechanisms in place. And then the second, sort of question is, in terms of making an investment in the distribution system to support greater electrification may sort of be needed to be answered in a is there a need for the larger distribution system to get more investment to support electrification, whether it's for medium and heavy duty or some other beneficial electrification aspect? There may or may not be an overbuilding that is happening here. So that's, in that perspective, there's different debates on whether or not, we could really make an overinvestment because the grid probably needs it if we're going to support all this electrification, even if it doesn't come directly from those medium and heavy duty vehicle customers.
And then I'll add that, introducing the idea of, truing up and clawing back from our customers raises some really thorny legal and administrative issues. So just for an example, the customer anticipated adding 5 buses in 3 years, but because of supply chain issues, those 5 buses get pushed out 2 additional years. Is the customer on the hook for that? Is their supplier on the hook for that? Do we have to anticipate a certain number or situations where that's forgiven or disallowed, or is it a strict annual? It becomes it potentially introduces some complicated administrative and legal issues.
I can understand that. Thanks. I think let's see. A follow-up there might be on the question of the 10 years. I'm not sure we've had too much conversation about that yet. I mean, that was proposed, but would adjusting the for future timing be potentially another variable, at least, that could be looked at here in terms of looking at the customer-based cap? And I could clarify too that, in thinking about fleet advisory services, the potential vision would be that this would obviously be working with, the customer, so it wouldn't be asking customers to come up on their own. What do you think your sales are going to be? That I think we all recognize that's an exercise that's requires some technical assistance, right? And so I know in other places in this docket we've talked a lot about fleet advisory services, and so the combination of doing some of that forward looking and trying to come up with a right size approach in terms of a incentive is just a concept that we're trying to explore rather than establishing it across the board, because as I think we heard earlier, there's a lot of variability, right, in the costs that can be incurred for the different installations based on the usage patterns and the type of fleet. There's a lot of variables here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I think we can move on briefly just for time's sake as well. There was slide 6, I believe. Ms. Lupoli, if you could just go back. I just wanted to clarify or ask one point here, and I appreciate the visual. I think it's really helpful. In other jurisdictions that the company is working on, you mentioned having the customer side make ready costs be included. Is there some benchmark in terms of a range of what the customer side of these make ready costs may be, recognizing that there's probably a high degree of variability on the utility side, but just try to get more insights in what percentage of utility side versus customer side we're kind of looking at here in the context of establishing a potential cap.
Yeah, so there's also a pretty wide range of variability on the customer side as well, and a lot of that comes down to the distance of trenching. And Sean, if you're on, maybe you could expand a little bit better than I could. But so the fewer, the smaller the length of the service on the customer side, the less expensive. But so, on a fleet side, it may need to be where it needs to be as far as distance from the service. So I don't know if Sean, if you have more thoughts on that, but the short answer is there's also a range of variability on the customer side.
Yeah, Kevin, to give it a little bit more color there, for the trenching, it's highly variable on this actual site conditions. As Kevin mentioned, the trenching distance, also the amount of potential concrete and asphalt restoration that would need to be done to restore the site after they do the digging. And then a lot of these fleet customers especially if they're going to be using DC fast charging, a lot of them are going to require additional transformation. They might be fed by a 120, 240 single phase or 208 three-phase service and require that additional 277, 480 transformation to power those DC fast chargers. So that would require a lot more additional switchgear and equipment on their side.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, on the customer side, we do have a little more flexibility so for certain types of fleets where we can make recommendations on how to minimize their, customer side costs on where to place the infrastructure if there needs to be additional infrastructure additions made. For some types of, use cases, there may not be as much flexibility as in terms of where they place their chargers. So that could add to the differences in the customer side costs. One other note I'll make is that we do have a really small pilot in our New York program that's been operational since 2020 that only provided medium and heavy duty vehicle make ready costs on the utility side. And we got very little to no takers across New York State. So they've recently changed that make ready pilot to allow for some customer side incentive as well to see if we can gain any learnings out of that pilot ahead of any program.
Okay, thank you. I think my last question is, I'm not sure if it pertains to a specific slide, but just wondering, kind of like a status update, if you will, if there's been opportunities that the utilities have looked into in Connecticut to understand, the interest in potential fleet electrification. Obviously, we have hopefully some folks on the phone today. We know we have our colleagues from DOT, and obviously there's, state policies around electric school bus electrification, but wondering if there's been efforts in recent months to kind of, take the temperature beyond some of those maybe identified players.
Sure, I'll start, and Sean, I'll let you fill in on the Eversource side. We certainly, with the EPA school bus grant application period, received a considerable amount of customer interest from the school bus segment. So I can't recall exactly how many applicants reached out to us for sort of the initial site viability, but it was more than 20, I believe. And then Sean, if you want to fill in any other additional sort of customer feedback you've received, that'd be great.
Yeah, a lot of the other interest we've received has been, in last mile delivery and municipal and state customers, really looking to lead by example and electrify their fleets, either on a, regional transit authority, potentially sanitation, trucks, and as well the school buses. A lot of municipalities we're seeing they have more of a medium duty vehicles that serve multiple purposes. So they may, have a medium duty class 4 to 6 that does serve multiple purposes along with a lot of those light duty fleet vehicles. So that's where we're seeing a lot of activity.
Okay, great. And could you just walk us through how the process, prior to getting to the interconnection stage, of course, the earlier on process kind of unfolds, in conversations with electric school buses, for example, what support is the utility providing?
Specifically for the EPA Clean School Bus Program, the Department of Environmental Protection is looking for essentially a will serve letter, that will be able to provide service in these locations, and then a high level schedule and cost estimate. Understanding that this is a snapshot in time, especially when we have look at available capacity on our system, that is a snapshot in time, and then as the months go on, there could be other customers that come to us with other projects that may start to eat into that capacity that we provide, when we have those. A lot of the other customer conversations we've been having outside of that have really been organically through the electric vehicle programs we have now. We're talking with some of those same customers about the light duty projects that they have that we're currently supporting under our light duty program. You know, they ask about some additional incentives and what would be available, you know, coming for the medium and heavy duty, and we refer them to this docket that we're developing.
Okay, thanks. Maybe just one final follow-up then on, you mentioned the electric school buses. It sounds like that might be some back and forth happening during an application process, but it's our understanding that if school buses or school districts rather have received funding from the Clean School Bus Program in Connecticut, what's kind of their next step then with the utility, and how is the utility supporting, you know, the implementation of or the receipt of school districts getting federal funding, for example?
At this time, it would go through our normal new customer connect process if they needed a service upgrade.
If they need a service upgrade, but what about the kind of initial steps before they get to that point? What support is provided?
We could certainly, you know, work with them on our hosting capacity map. You know, we will be able to kind of, you know, show them what the available capacity is at a premise that they're looking to you know, implement the charging, and then, you know, really, you know, we could help refer them to electricians. You know, at that point, then it would be a lot of the more of the cost would be on the customer side, and you know, they could get some cost estimates from there from the electrical contractor.
Is that the same for UI?
Yeah, that's it would go through our normal processes. We, you know, have learned there's a bit of back and forth sometimes once that initial, you know, load study request is put in, which is you know, how it initiates the process for the customer. And, you know, certainly where there's opportunity for that customer to have good, you know, advisory, let's say, ahead of time, will decrease that, you know, back and forth, and therefore the time to interconnect for the project. But we are seeing that there's differences between how prepared the customer is when they come to us with that load study sheet. You know, it's not a straightforward sort of calculation of this is how much load I potentially need based on this number of buses. So I think there's definitely a learning curve, particularly for school districts on that side.
So is either company kind of currently moving forward or having continued conversations with any school districts to be able to assist in implementing, you know, a receipt of federal funding to purchase a school bus?
I'm not aware, so I'd have to get back to you on that if we have any school districts in Connecticut. I do know that we do have some in New York, but they haven't moved forward yet with any infrastructure installations. It's still somewhat early.
And I know that Eversource is working with at least one developer who's working with the school district to electrify their fleet as a result of grant reception.
And when you say working with, can you just expand upon like what that looks like? I'm just trying to understand. I know that there's like a, you know, facilities study process that needs to be done, but like before getting to that point, kind of how, what assistance is being provided?
Sure. So I can talk you through it. So that particular developer reached out through me because I'm the EPA school bus grant point of contact for Eversource. I took that customer through a whole education about what is and isn't available as far as incentives, and what might be available in the future as far as rates. But that's really, you know, just talking him through the existence of this docket. We went through together the hosting capacity map and saw that that there was availability, I think, for the number of chargers they were putting in currently at that site. And then I showed him our new customer connect page and took him through what the process would be to initiate a new customer request. And at that point, he enters his information and it's handed off to our distribution engineering field folks.
Okay.
And that is a
thank-
similar process at UI.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, I just have two quick follow-ups based on Ms. Cohen's questions, and then we can take our lunch break. The first, just making sure I heard correctly earlier, Ms. Cohen asked a question, I think, about, at least I was interpreting it as whether either utility has done any type of like potential study in terms of the number of fleets that are available or interested, not just interested, but like available for electrification in each of your service territories. And it sounds like the answer is no. You just have some additional anecdotes. Is that fair?
Yeah, we haven't yet, but we do have a medium and heavy duty EV forecasting and load study that we're expecting to get some results on sometime towards the end of the year. It's across New York and our Connecticut OPCOs. It was part of our recent rate case, so we have that study happening.
Thank you. Mr. On anything?
Yeah, so agree with your first statement, and also say that our system planning folks are, working on similar forecasting efforts to what Ms. Patricia just referenced on our side as well.
Okay, but you don't have any timeline for the results in Eversource's OPCOs?
I'd have to talk to the system planning folks to get you that answer. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. And the second clarifying question, we had the slide up earlier that talked about the, I think Ms. Cohen did a good job trying to convey what we were hoping to achieve with that that cap on incentives, the incremental distribution revenue cap, articulating it as like a customer protection. And by that, in my mind, I'm thinking about non-participants. So making sure that the costs to achieve this electrification are not outweighing the benefits. And so I'm just wondering if, now that you might have better insight into what we were hoping to achieve with that, if you had a response to how your alternative, because I think she asked you the question, like, so how would you change our proposal? And I think both of you answered, and please correct me if I'm didn't get this right, but I took both of your companies to answer, like, we don't think we can make any suggestions to Pura's proposal. So I guess my question for you is, what about your proposal, which I think is more of a, which I took to be more of a total budget, like, how does that protect non-participating customers by ensuring that the amount that we spend on individual electrification isn't doesn't outstrip the potential revenue that the utility generates and the other utility customers receive? I just can you I can try to restate that simpler, but if you understood that question, I'm just looking for your reaction.
Yeah, so I do understand the question, and as I mentioned, I don't think, well, we haven't found yet a perfect solution to that. And so our proposal was to have a cap certainty at I think we placed it at 3 megawatts, the 1,300 per kilowatt up to 3 megawatts, just to have that cap certainty, which isn't perfect. And there may be customers whose 10-year incremental distribution revenue doesn't achieve that 3 million, and there probably will be customers who have much more than that. 3.9 million. So no, it's not perfect either, but it gives a certain budget certainty for us for when we're going and planning out how we staff, implement, and raise the capital necessary to implement the program.
Thank you. I will let you respond. I'm sorry, but I understand how your approach is desirable from a utility perspective, but I don't understand how that protects the ratepayers. So when you say the three, when you talked about the size cap, like, is there any magic to that number? Like, is there evidence out there that suggests projects that or customers that exceed that don't return the revenue that offset the cost? Or like, is there any science behind picking that number?
So again, it leads us back to the point about how early we are in this market and how we don't know what we don't know. So, you know, I really can't give an answer that leads to a certain, like a certainty in protection from the non-participants, but at the same time, I don't see how the attachment one proposal can really either at this point. So
Is that because you haven't looked at incremental distribution revenue potential?
well, because we just don't have a way to do that because there's such variability between all these different customers, even within a customer class. As mentioned before, you know, school bus, the school bus system in Branford and the one in Stanford are just going to be, you know, completely different, even with the same number of buses. Just becomes a repeating exercise of every single available customer is going to have a completely different usage pattern, and it's not like other types of utility customer classes, which tend to be much more predictable.
Yeah, totally understood. I guess what I'm struggling with is, like, definitionally, our proposal does ensure that non-participating customers are not being harmed, because it ensures that the incremental distribution revenue exceeds the cost. So when you say, so I guess what I'm trying to dig into is your response is that that it's not that our proposal doesn't achieve that, it's that you don't have any way you can't see any way to do our like, and maybe I'm splitting hairs, but I'm just trying to figure out any nuance between that.
Chairman, may I ask the clarify?
Oh, go ahead.
Based on that, I think, and perhaps Kevin and Christine understand it better, but just my understanding and what you just said, I know that was declared in the original straw proposal. There was a statement that said what you just said, which is that a properly designed framework would ensure that the incremental revenues cover the incremental costs. That was a statement, but I'm not sure. First of all, I don't know if that was in attachment one. Our struggle has been to figure out exactly how to do that. And I think that's what Kevin is saying, is that would be great. That would be wonderful if that were the case. But in reality, we don't have the visibility or certainty that will happen. That if you want to design an uncapped program for medium and heavy duty fleet vehicle electrification, to ensure that the revenues from that program will offset all encompassing costs, the incentives, the customer side, the utility side, we don't think that's realistic. So could you elaborate on where or how that design would work?
Yeah, thank you. I think we saw those comments on the initial straw proposal and tried to address it in the revision in attachment one with the 100% and 50% caps. So I think we were trying to meet there. I'm just wondering, like, this discussion today was really helpful in understanding what your all concerns were, and I think we were trying to convey here what the objective was with our proposal. So like, by specifying the cap based on 10 years of incremental sales and then having the 100% and the 50% embedded in there, we're trying to see if that gave you the added detail that you would need, understanding that this is a calculation that you'd have to perform for each customer, and just wondering if there's a way that we could meet your all's objective of having budget certainty. Like, surely you could layer on a total budget cost while still trying to pursue an incremental distribution revenue to achieve both goals. So I don't mean to present it as an either or. I just think they're solving for different things. Does that help?
Not for me, but I'm not the expert on it. Was there analysis in attachment one that explained or provided an example that perhaps we could refer to, which said what you just said, but with the numbers or analysis behind it to show that how the 100% and 50% cap would be applied, or how an individual customer analysis of those incremental revenues would work in the context of attachment one? I have struggled to understand how we could use revenues that would be incremental as, essentially to offset costs when those same revenues are to be used as an incentive, to make the interconnection in the first place. That's just a fundamental misunderstanding that I haven't been able to track from the beginning, where we're going to have new customers from EVs. And I understand that would in theory create some level of incremental revenues. I think Kevin is pointing out we don't know how to quantify that. It's going to be different on each customer basis, as will the behind the underlying costs to connect them. Those revenues then, in theory, based on Pura's straw proposal, would offset all incremental costs, both that we would have to incur and the customer would have to incur in order to incentivize them to interconnect. So if you're going to do that on an individual basis, I have just struggled to understand how we can both use those revenues as an incentive to the customer and still pay for those incentives. And we don't have the revenues to do it. We've used it as the incentive for the customer. I'm not sure if that's clear, but I think having an example might help. Perhaps it is there and I just didn't see it. Having an example would help to show exactly how Pure is tracking or has data that thinks we should be looking at that you don't think we are looking at.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we were looking for the exact feedback that we're talking there about, like how this structure could or would work. Like you had the example in your all's presentation today that I think we could borrow from, but there's the numbers that I just said, the specifying that the cap is based on 10 years of incremental sales, like those numbers were in the straw proposal as a starting point to give you something to react to. So I think we were just trying to throw out there that a goal, an objective of this would be to ensure that non-participating customers are not being harmed. And an idea to achieve that would be to ensure that the incremental distribution revenues exceed the incentives that we would be paying out. But let me, I think at this point I probably can't take this any further with you right now. I think I've exceeded my understanding of what we're looking for. But we can go back. Maybe we can both go back to our respective staff and colleagues and reread comments and the attachment with kind of today's conversation in mind, with hopefully a better understanding of the objectives.
Great.
Okay. Ms. Ficaccia, I never let you respond to the questions. If there's anything else that you wanted to add before we get
yeah, I just want to make a note that we did pull that 3 megawatt cap based off of some others that we saw. I think I saw that in California and then in New York as well for larger loads. That program has capped it at 3 megawatts. Actually, it increased it to 6 megawatts for parts of the state. And that's really for the light duty program, not even medium and heavy duty, but it does provide some sort of cap on the size. Not just kind of open-ended to what potentially your revenue could be over 10 years. So that was part of the impetus of giving some type of megawatt cap and basing it on some knowledge that was available to us in other jurisdictions and in other parts of the country. I think, I just want to also reiterate quickly, because I know everyone's probably hungry, that we are, as committed to helping the state drive and reach their climate goals through electrification and transportation electrification, especially medium and heavy duty, is a great mechanism to do that. We also, in this conversation, are concerned with, how this impacts all of our ratepayers. And in the proposal that you have stated out where as Doug mentioned, we're providing the incentive to the customer and then trying to understand how to pay the system back through that when we've already offered that as an incentive to the customer does put a lot of risk at who ends up kind of taking on that assumed calculation between us and those specific customers. So we're also really concerned about kind of how we would, make sure to drive the state in reaching those climate goals and also be thoughtful about how the customers are going to be impacted in the long run as the total system, is invested in. Thanks.
Right, thank you. And I think that's the genesis of why we're trying to put a proposal out there to seek feedback on how to achieve that protection. Okay, with my apologies to all of the stakeholders on the call for going significantly over, we are going to now take our lunch break. So we'll reconvene at 1:15 with the presentation from the Department of Transportation before transitioning into our stakeholder discussion. So let me, I hope the Eversource and UI teams aren't going anywhere and you'll be back after lunch, but I do want to make sure to stop and thank and acknowledge your presentation and thank you for answering our question. So we will see everyone back after the lunch break. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon. See, Attorney Pace has his hand up.
Hi, Chairman. Thank you very much. I wanted to raise, if I can, with your permission, just a procedural question. It's something that was discussed right before the break, and therefore I'd like leave just to be able to raise the issue for your consideration. And first of all, thank you for the exchange with Mr. Horton. That was very helpful. Right before the break, there was a discussion between you and Mr. Horton on the issue of program funding. And I know the chair ruled earlier today that program funding falls outside the scope of attachment 1. And what I wanted to point out is when we looked at the procedural schedule, we see that the next step is written comments due on the 12th, and that's limited to the subject matter of attachment 1. And then we have briefs due on the 26th of April, and the current next step is a draft decision on June 20th. And we wanted to make a motion for the authority's consideration, and that is, could there be an addition to the schedule to allow for further comment and analysis on the issue of program funding before the draft decision is issued on the 20th? And so the authority can rule from the bench or consider that. We can submit something in writing if that's helpful to the authority. But I wanted to raise the issue while it was fresh in my mind since the EDC panelists completed their discussion. I'm happy to take any questions, Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Attorney Pace. I think in my discussion earlier with Mr. Bond, I was trying to hint at that. I know that we have a schedule up. I'm not sure that that is the schedule that we're going to necessarily move forward with, because we want to make sure that we have a complete record. And we're not going to know if we have a complete record until we start to see some of the responses to the discovery. So I think based on that, I would just say that I think the motion's a tad premature, because I think we want to take it under consideration. I'll say I'll take it under consideration when I see what else we need to gather in terms of discovery and what form that might take. So I appreciate you flagging it to us, and happy to see that motion in writing if after any adjustments are made, you don't think that we've captured what your question was. But that's what I would say right now is just take it under advisement pending any changes to the schedule.
Thank you for the chance to offer the question. I appreciate it, Chairman. Thank you for the feedback.
Thank you, Attorney Pace. So let's take up the presentation from our colleagues at the Department of Transportation. The Attorney Sexton, welcome back. Thank you, as always, for your continued engagement in this proceeding. And I think we may have met both of your colleagues before, but if you want to introduce them and also let us know if you would prefer to run your slides or if you'd like the authority to.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Yes, Alice Sexton for the record for Connecticut DOT. Graham Curtis is our Assistant Transit Administrator here at Connecticut DOT, and Romaine is Camara is Planner 2, I believe, in our Public Transportation Bureau. And I'm going to let you have met them before, and I'm going to let them. If you would have the authority to run the slides, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Great. All set? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak. I know there's a lot of very complicated issues involved here, so I thought I would just give you kind of an update. So some of the things that we know, there is some relative clarity on our path forward. So I'd like to just kind of share an update of where we are. I believe it's been almost 18 months since we last presented this slide, so there's been a lot of advancements in our program. Next slide. So these are our high-level objectives of the DOT. Our plan is to implement a carbon reduction solutions by deploying zero-emission and medium heavy-duty transit vehicles throughout the state of Connecticut, which will allow us to meet the state legislative mandates and executive orders, specifically to support the goals of 30% electrifying of our fleet by 2030 and 100% by 2035. And also, we would like to achieve cost predictability with innovative rate design to support the conversion of the state's entire diesel bus fleet to battery electric buses, while maintaining and/or expanding our level of service. Next slide. Just for a little overview of our system, Connecticut DOT supports the operations of a very complex public transportation system, including bus and rail. Connecticut directly owns in excess of 600 buses, full-size city buses, and delivers more than 35 million passenger trips per year in Connecticut. We also contract with 22 bus service providers to provide dial-a-ride, express bus, and other services that include an additional 200 full-size buses and 450 smaller transit buses. ConnDOT supports these other contracted services, including the utility costs of these providers. Next slide. So this is giving an over where we are. There are 15 transit facilities in the state of Connecticut that are planned for electrification. We have completed 11 power studies for these facilities. The few remaining that we have not done are smaller facilities or paratransit facilities that do not run diesel buses. 9 of those facilities are in design and or construction as of this year. We have opened 3 pilot programs in Connecticut Transit's Hartford, Hamden, and Stamford locations, and we will have 3 additional pilot programs up and running 2024 in Middletown, Wyndham, and Milford transit districts. To the left is just the number, the 15 facilities, and the asterisk mark is the ones that have completed power studies. Next slide. Relative to obviously we can't use buses until we have the chargers and the infrastructure in place. This is just an update of where we are as of right now. Connecticut Hartford has 8 chargers in place. Hamden has 10 chargers in place, and Connecticut Transit Stamford has 5 chargers in place. Stamford, which is scheduled to be the first facility, which is 100% electric. The construction of 100% electrification in that facility is in construction and is due to be completed in 2025 with the deployment of 28 chargers and 38 pantograph chargers. Additionally, we're building a freestanding building for additional 5 chargers and 11 pantograph chargers and 1 450 kW fast charger. Next slide, please. Currently, we have 11 buses in operation in Connecticut, 7 in Hamden, 4 in Stamford, using those pilot programs, as I mentioned. The batteries are 525 kilowatt hour batteries, and we're currently seeing a range between 2 and 4 kilowatt hours per mile, or an average of 2.7, which equates to a range of approximately 150 miles in the winter and 200 miles in the summer. Next slide. This is the electric bus update. Currently, as I mentioned, we have 11 buses in operation. This year, we will be taking possession of 50 additional buses. So this is going beyond pilot to actual deployment at a partial share of our services. These have become mission critical to our operations. The projected deployment of the buses are 8 in Hartford, 13 additional in Hamden and Stamford, 10 Connecticut Transit Waterbury facility, and the 3 pilots I mentioned in Middletown, Wyndham, and Milford will be getting 2 full-size electric buses. In addition, the first 10 electric vans will also be deployed in our paratransit operations in the next month. Next slide. BEB charging. So as I mentioned, the batteries are 525 kilowatt hours. Currently, we are using a 150 kilowatt charger with a direct plug-in. We are moving towards, as the advancement in battery charging technologies increased, we're moving to a 180 kilowatt charger with a 2-to-1, and those are going to be charged with a pantograph. The image here is of a pantograph overhead charger. All future buses we procure are going to be pantograph, i.e. overhead charging ready. And we're also going to be deploying the ABB, the 450 fast chargers, which will give us the ability to top off during the day. In terms of where our charging strategies are, since our buses are generally en route during the day, we plan on charging the vast majority of these off peak or off peak between 5 p.m. and 10 a.m. As we get closer to beyond 50 to 100% of our fleet, we do anticipate the need to charge approximately 20% of the charges during the day to top off the chargers. Most of that will be done the use of fast charging technology, either in the depot or remote locations distributed throughout the state, which we are currently deploying several of those locations and planning additional locations typically at rail stations and facilities where buses come together. Next slide. I know that there's a lot of information, so one way we use to kind of get our head around what this process looks like. This is a chart. Let me just explain. So the blue bars are the capacity that of our facilities that we need for charging. This is based on 600 buses. So as we build facilities, we increase capacity in the blue bars. The black line is the actual buses that we have. And you can see that's a sliding scale. It's approximately 1/12 of the fleet is replaced each year. It varies because the actual age of the buses. So there are some fluctuations in that. The 2 stars are the milestone goals that we are tasked with complying with the state of Connecticut. The 30% is the first star, and the 100% is by 2035. Right now, we're moving forward, as I said, with most of our facilities. The next major milestones are going to be the New Haven phase 2 and Hartford phase 1. These beyond that, these 2 facilities require significant offsite transmission power upgrades in the magnitude of $30 to $75 to $100 million. These are the final 2 major hurdles we have in place to overcome to fully electrify the facilities. And we have been working with the Eversource and UI to discuss the logistics of how that would actually work. But those are pretty well defined as our 2 main. Most of the other smaller facilities, talking to the power companies, there is capacity without significant offsite upgrades. But basically, you can see the loads. I mean, since we are mandated not to purchase any additional diesel buses, the load in basically a bus lasts approximately 12 years. So the timing of this transition is fairly well defined, predicated on the ability to solve the issues with the offsite charging infrastructures. We have received quite a bit of federal funding, and the state is committed to providing state share to implement this transition. Next slide. And that's the high level overview of where we are. So any questions about our transition?
Thank you so much. Let me check in with my staff, peer staff, Ms. Viagrass, followed by Ms. Cohen. Any questions?
Thank you, Chairman. I don't have any questions at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen.
Yeah, I think I just have 1 or 2 follow-ups. Thank you, Mr. Curtis, for that presentation. Yep. I wanted to follow up. Maybe we can flip to the slide, Laura. I forget which number it had the charging. Maybe 1 more. Oh, yes, this slide. Perfect. The kind of future charging periods. Can you talk us through a little bit about the agency's planning with the 80-20 split in particular, and kind of what your operational needs may be, or if this is determined based on the rate structure that you're currently under?
It's kind of a combination of things. So we do need to charge mostly off peak. So, and we do work, so we have some flexibility about when we charge. That window is 17 hours. I think, we need a minimum, maybe 8 to 10 hours to charge, conceptually, the fleet with the capacity. So we have some flexibility to move around within that time frame. The limitation of the reason we're projecting 20% during the day has to do with the capacity of the existing battery technology to meet the needs of a single day. As I mentioned, each bus can get between 150 and 200 miles during the day. Some of our routes are, 200 or 250. So a 1 nighttime charge will not be adequate to charge the whole day. So we have to either go somewhere and get a fast charge, exterior, or go back to the depot. That said, we are optimistic that as we get, farther down the road, the density and the size of the batteries will be reduced. So we will, it'll reduce some of this need to daytime charge, and we can almost go fully to off peak. But right now, there's some uncertainty in the battery electric market, specifically due to a loss of several domestic manufacturers. So we're hesitant to project that the batteries will solve all our problems. Every day there's an article somewhere that says the next generation of battery technology is going to solve all our problems. But hopefully that comes. And we do have a bit of time to get to that point. We have 10 years before we transition to that point. But we do need to move forward with our two biggest facilities. As I said, Hamden has 150 buses and Hartford has 300 buses. So, a very high percentage are located in those facilities. So we're planning for those facilities, but we need some level of certainty to know that power is going to be there as we commit to purchase the buses. I mean, we are buying the buses and we have no choice not to. So does that answer your question?
I think it's definitely started to, and thank you for all that context. I appreciate it. I think what caught my eye, at least on this slide, was the window period. So the 5 to 10. I'm not sure if that aligns, and we have, I think, the experts from the utilities in terms of the existing tariff on peak, off peak timing.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that completely aligns with it. So I was just trying to understand if you were, if the 5 to 10 is significant, 5 to 10 p.m., excuse me, is significant from a DOT operational standpoint, or if that was reflective of something in the tariff.
I mean, I know that they don't necessarily align, and that was like the largest window. I mean, we could live with, as I said, we could live with, an 8-10 hour window. So if it was a matter of pushing that off peak back to say 8 or 9, we could definitely do that.
Okay, so there is like some degree of flexibility there, because I believe, and I could get this wrong on the spot here, but I believe Eversource's on peak might be 12 to 8, but UI's, I think theirs is 10 to 6, I think, for this, at least this rate class that would be applicable, and certainly happy to have either utility jump in and correct if that's wrong. So it sounds like there's a difference perhaps depending on utility service territory, but that there may be, I think what you're saying is flexibility in terms of when to start that nighttime charging.
Right. I mean, we do have some charges, but lower levels of charging will come as the buses return back at like 5 or 6, but the major peaks won't happen until, much later in the evening, 10 or 12 o'clock.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that context. Thank you. Chair, that's the only questions I have.
Yeah, I would mention on the slide, we are planning on using charge managed software. We have procured a mobility house that has the ability to manage, maximum. This is, as you can imagine, as you get upwards of 100 vehicles that are all charging simultaneously, it's not easy. You're not just going to plug them in like you would a car. So the pantographs gives you the ability to manage the software and minimize the peak. So we're optimistic that we could, lower the peak, 10 or 15% below what we projected, but we're hesitant to guarantee that is going to work until we actually deploy the software and, actually works in operation. Because you could build a perfect Swiss watch, but can we actually operate that level of accuracy? We've done projections where you can, it's like a game of Tetris almost, where you plug in the different time slots. But we're hesitant to fully commit because we think we need the capacity right now until it's a proof of concept that it works.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. And for me, I just have a very minor clarification question. Where it says 80% charging during 5 to 10, is that 10 a.m. or 10 p.m.?
10 a.m. So it's
10 a.m. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense in the context of your last answer. Just wanted to make sure.
Exactly.
Great. Well, let me see if there are any stakeholders with questions for our DOT colleagues before we let them off the hot seat here. Mr. Davis.
I just wanted to confirm that the Eversource peak period is currently, and in our proposals, is 12 noon to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Thank you. Okay.
Got it. As I said, we have some flexibility where we can, do with that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Well, to our DOT colleagues, thank you very much for your presentation, for the updates that you provided, answering our questions. I think we can let you off the hot seat.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, so we wanted to move into a stakeholder discussion, and I think the PRS staff have some slides, perhaps that just have the prompts pulled from our request for written comments, hoping that we can generate some discussion this afternoon, recognizing that there is still an open request for written comments out there, I do want to see if there are reactions or conversation dialogue that we can generate today. So Laura, if you could go to the next slide for me, please. Okay, so we had a lot of prompts that were issued in our request for written comments around the topics of rate design. So we were hoping to see if there were any parties on the phone, on the Zoom today that have not yet had a chance to weigh in, particularly if we have any fleet owners or operators that were able to attend today. We're looking primarily for feedback from you all. If there are questions, concerns, recommendations, obviously you have the opportunity to respond in writing as well, but if there was anything that was easier to voice, wanted to provide some space for that. So again, the raise hand function is under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. If you can't find that, happy for you to come off mute and I can try to recognize you that way. But are there folks that want to be heard on this first grouping of prompts on rate design? Mr. Watson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I am Bill Watson. I am a consultant for the Office of Consumer. And what I'd like to do is ask a couple of questions from what the presentation was made earlier by the EDCs. Is that allowable at this point?
Yeah, I'm sorry. We did get backed up in the agenda earlier, such that we didn't have time for questions for the EDCs. I'm happy to see if the EDCs are still around and available for questions. Are all of your is your hand raised exclusively for questions for the EDCs? Or did you have comments that you wanted to offer here too? Because if it's exclusively questions, then I might ask that you hold on to them for just a minute longer and we can go back to questions for the EDCs after I get through these prompts, but I don't want to prematurely cut you off here.
Right, mine are just for the EDCs, questions for the EDCs.
Okay, all right, then Mr. Watson, if I can ask you to hold that and I promise to come back to you after we get through these prompts. So I'll ask the EDCs to stand by. So Ms. Lupley, if you can go to the next slide. I don't think I'm not seeing any takers on this rate design slide. Is there any stakeholder that wants to be heard on charging infrastructure incentives? I think the prompts that you're seeing on the screen now are the ones that we've asked for written comments on. If there are any questions or comments, see Nick Krakoff.
Yeah, hey, I'm Nick Krakoff from Conservation Law Foundation. I also have a question for the utilities that I would like to ask about this particular subject, but I guess, the gist of it is that I'm concerned with what I heard from the utilities that there's not really a budget using this incentive cap, so we don't really know, what we're getting if we use this approach. In Massachusetts and their EV program, they had actual fixed budgets for the incentives, and so I think it's a little bit concerning that would, if we go with this approach with the incentive cap, that there'd be no budget, and we wouldn't really be knowing sort of how much of an incentive we'd be providing.
Okay. Thank you. Let's I'll come back to you for questions for the EDCs. Is there anyone else that wants to respond now to the prompts on this slide? Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so the authority issued a written request for written comments on flexible interconnection. That prompt is on the screen. Is there anyone that wants to comment or provide feedback at this time on this topic? All right. Laura, is there one more slide? I'm sorry, I can't remember. There is underserved communities. Does anyone want to provide any comments at this time regarding these written prompt requests? Okay. Ms. Harari.
Good afternoon, Chair Gillette. I just want to note, as pertains to our previous comments in this docket, that under the Connecticut Clean Air Act, low environmental justice school districts are required to transition their school bus fleets to alternative fuels by 2030. And as cited by the EDCs in their presentation earlier, that school bus fleets can really be different from location to location in their needs. And we would request that this group in particular be supported to the extent possible by any decision in this docket. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Charlie Alcock? Alcock. Sarah, just want to make sure you come off mute. Sorry, Mr. Alcock, if you're talking, I can't hear you. I'm not sure if anybody else is able to. All right. Maybe you can come back. Attorney Sexton?
One question that Conduct had for our written comments in February was, what is the location of the fleet? Is it where it operates or is it where they charge? And I think that needs to be clarified at some point.
Very good, thank you. And I'd say that that's an excellent example of what we're looking for here, even if you don't have the answers. I think that's one of the things that we're specifically taking comments on. So if no one wants to be heard on a suggestion or recommendation for the answer to that question today, would really look forward to receiving feedback on that in written comments, because I think we recognize from Condot's comments that is a question that needs to be addressed, and we'd like to address that using feedback from stakeholders. So please make sure if you have a recommendation on this, saying this generally to any stakeholder, would love for you to weigh in on that in written comments.
I think we would like both, right? So I throw that out there, but I don't know that that's going to be realistic. So
thank you. All right, maybe we can go to the final slide on program costs. So specifically, we're seeking comments on how to set a budgetary cap for fleet advisory services, other types of program administration costs. So looking for folks to weigh in now or through written comments. Really interested in methodologies that could be used here. Okay, maybe we can take down these slides. Ms. Lively, thank you. If nothing else, that was hopefully a refresher to everyone about what we're looking for feedback on. We did have someone that I couldn't quite hear before, Charlie Alcock, if you want to try one more time. I see you back on the screen.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Charlie Alcock, and I'm a consultant advisor to Daimler Trucks North America. Got 40% market share of Class 8 trucks. And we're really excited about the kind of work that you're talking about here today. We think this is really important. However, there's a lot of conversations about Make Ready, and it's great to be talking about the incentives and the programs to get to that point of common intersection. I think it's slide 8 or 6 on Eversource's slide, where there is a power pole. But we are more concerned about the grid infrastructure upstream from that. The feeder capacity, the substation capacity, those are the things that we think as most utilities are running their systems more or less at capacity these days, that it's the long time infrastructure that needs to be built. And that's where we think this proceeding merits more conversations to look at these larger cost items. They tend to be in a general rate case. They tend to have longer cycles. And we're talking about 2030 and 2032, which is 6 and 8 years away. And this infrastructure takes a lot longer to build. So that's a general comment that we'd like to offer up, is our concern for this grid infrastructure upstream from that point of common interconnection. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. All right, anyone else with comments on the stakeholder prompts or just public comments generally before I wrap back around to Mr. Watson's question? All right, can I ask if Mr. Bond and Ms. Ficaccia are still available for questions? I think I had Mr. Watson teed up here. See Mr. Bond is back. So Mr. Watson, do you want to give it a go with some of your questions, please?
Yeah, I have a couple. One was in reference to what I think Mr. Davis had mentioned in his presentation, and it dealt with a comment that scenario 1 had the rate schedule in scenario 1 was a revenue neutral rate schedule. And I'd like a little more elaboration on that to determine how, to try to determine how that was, that result came about, as to how, you know, what was the comparison to for scenario 1 to determine that it was revenue neutral?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. Can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so revenue neutral in this case is where we took an existing intermediate general service rate 56. So that's one of our rate classes that serves C&I customers.
Right.
And it's the same basis that we used for our light duty rate design. So what that does is give us a revenue requirement for each of the rate components: distribution, transmission. There's an assumed pricing for energy supply, and that's not so much a revenue requirement as it is the price we pay. But then there are the tracking mechanisms, et cetera. So in scenario one, we had submitted a rate schedule and there were some worksheets that had kind of a breakdown of all the different prices by those service categories. But the revenue neutral aspect is we start with an existing rate, let's say for distribution, and there's a total revenue requirement for the class. The class has a certain average load factor. We redesigned the rate to meet all the various parameters, but we did it in a way that solved at the class average what the full pricing would be. And then we worked our way through, and in this case, 8 tranches, I believe. So they're up to the full average rate class. We basically said, let's for different levels of load factor under rate 56, we would redesign the rate so that a share of the demand charges would be converted to kilowatt hour based charges. And then we further time differentiated that using a marginal cost differential between peak and off peak. And we did that same approach for wherever there was a demand charge. So there are 4 types of demand charges in our rate class. So each of those types of demand charges has a revenue requirement associated with that. And so we ultimately solved to that total revenue requirement. So that's kind of the premise for having a so-called revenue neutral rate design in this case. I don't know if that answers your question, or you want a little more, explanation.
I don't think so. Just to follow up though,
Sure.
the distribution component by itself well, let me ask you this way. Each of the components that you outlined here, were each of those components determined to be revenue neutral in and of themselves? So for instance, this
That's
is a
correct.
distribution component.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah.
One way to the other.
No, I'm sorry. I spoke too quick. Did you mind to ask the question again, just so I can make sure I answered it?
Okay. And I'm focusing specifically on the distribution component of
Okay.
the rate. With the scenario one distribution component, was that revenue neutral with the rate 56 distribution component?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
For the non-customer charge piece, correct.
Right. Okay.
And if you look at, we filed the January 10th filing, we submitted what's called attachment 2.1. And there's a worksheet, and it actually lays out the details of that. And you can look in there and see all the different rate components in the rate design. And then there are a full breakdown comparing the rate 56 and then what rate 56 looks like at each of the tiers. So that might be helpful to further answer your question.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
One other question I have is on in a data response to interrogatory CAE 007, the response referred to the tariff provisions of an Eversource tariff, and I think they refer to it as NB12. And that tariff, as I understand it, sets caps for funding for incremental load. Whereas if you exceed that cap, and then you on projected revenue, then the incremental load is not assessed any additional charges for interconnection. That's my understanding. Having read it.
No, I can start. That's what's called new business policy. That's what the MB stands for.
Right.
We have a number of those, and that one has to be MB12. I'm not fresh on that one. I don't know, Kevin, I don't know if you have any insight you could add. I could research it and follow up on your question, but.
Well, let me, the question was, did that inform at all the decision to set the rate, the make-ready caps for the incentives?
I believe part of the use of that is where we can project what the revenue might be relative to, I think in this case, I'd say the make-ready investment, and I'm gonna maybe say basically when a customer has to make a contribution for connecting. But I'm gonna qualify that because I haven't refreshed on this, but I don't know, Kevin, did I get that right, or at least in the right ballpark?
Well, I just want to answer the question. So from the Eversource perspective of what we proposed on January 10th, and then the comments we just made in response to attachment 1, no, we didn't use MB12 as a reference for setting any of the incentives that we proposed.
Okay. That's all I have, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. And earlier it sounded, Mr. Krakoff, that you might have a question for the utilities.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I have a question about something that was in the proposal from the EDCs, or I guess it's the response to procedural order. And so this is about the incremental revenue cap. And I guess it was on page 21. The EDC said that basically what this incremental revenue cap, I guess, was not an incentive above and beyond the policy that applies to a new customer today. You also said it does not substantially differ from existing new business policies, and that you didn't think it would substantially incentivize customers. I guess could you just explain, both your statement that you don't think it would substantially incentivize customers, as well as, how this policy differs from existing policies for new customers, how that's different, I guess.
Yeah, so let me just take a step back. So when the way we understood, because the response to procedural order was responding to the original, obviously, procedural order, and then now we're talking about attachment 1, which slightly tweaks that. So I don't want to take us back in time, but we're in progress, but I guess I would say that the way we understood the original incentive, which was based on increased distribution revenue, which in attachment 1, it's not. That's just what the cap on the $1,300 per kilowatt incentive is. So it's no longer the incentive, it's the cap on a different incentive. But when the way we understood it originally, it didn't really differ substantially from what MB12 does, which is offset the interconnection cost by an X% of, or 6.7 years worth of revenue. So, but we've kind of moved on from that. But that was how we were thinking about that original incentive. That wasn't really an incentive at all, and it was really only focused on that utility side and had nothing to do with the customer side of the equation. So it didn't, but again, I want to, as we've iterated, I want to move us to where we're going. So.
All right, thanks for clarifying that.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I think we've reached the end of our agenda for today's technical meeting. If there's anyone who feels like they have not had a chance to be heard, I'd invite that now before we adjourn. Okay. All right. Well, then just as a reminder, the immediate next step in this docket is responses to our request for written comments, which are due on April 12th. So still a little bit more time to get your thoughts in order. That meeting, I'm sorry, that deadline again is April 12th. So I look forward to everyone's feedback and writing on any or all of those comments. So with that, I think we've reached the end of today's agenda. I'm thankful for everyone's participation today with your comments, questions, and presentations. So if there's nothing further for today, we are going to adjourn.